She held the blue heart in her palm and listened to the hospital's fluorescent hum like a verdict. It was all she had left that still belonged to someone else. Her mother's, a talisman from better days. Yet the stack of unpaid invoices felt alive. Inches from setting the bed she sat beside out into the hallway. The blue heart was small, chipped at the edge, a pale sapphire encased in silver. It had seen birthdays that smelled of canned cake, and winters warmed with a single electric heater. Tonight it tasted like desperation. Outside, the city glittered in a different light. Glass towers, private cars, couture coats that never brushed a shoulder stained by broth. When she stepped into that world, Vivian Jiang had to relearn how to move her hands so they would not betray the way her knuckles had reddened from scrubbing hospital floors and night shifts. The man at the top of one of those towers, Tyson Fu, already knew how to measure people by what they cost and what they could be made to give. The first time she signed his contract, she had convinced herself it was for a moment, a bridge. It was not framed as nothing. Lawyers called it a companionship agreement. The press would later call it scandal if it leaked. For her, the paper was simple arithmetic. 3 years of regular payments, a small apartment near one of Tyson's subsidiaries, a curator's anonymity, and her mother's surgery scheduled without delay. For Tyson, it was control calculated in precise terms. Time, boundaries, expectations, and the sort of anonymity he preferred where others performed gratitude on cue. In the 3 years since, Vivian learned to navigate the spaces a woman in an arrangement occupies. The public face he allowed, the private rules he enforced, the small mercies he sometimes granted without looking like mercy. She learned to keep her throat steady when another woman laughed too loudly in a restaurant he owned, to accept a terse text with a calendar emoji that meant change, to leave before dawn when his schedule demanded it. She learned that the blue heart, wrapped now in a hospital tissue, could be converted into currency, if she could bear the trade. Tyson Fu's reputation was a blade honed sharp. Chairman's son, architect of ruthless mergers, a man photographed more often than politicians. He cultivated an image like armor, slick hair, tailored suits, a jaw set as if it could close around any inconvenient truth. And the board of Fu Group liked the armor. In public he was all precision. At night, behind the mahogany doors of his office, his gestures were still precise, but the edges were frayed by an old loneliness he rarely let himself look at. He noticed things that were not headlines. He noticed the way Vivian's fingers worried the hem of her sleeves when she waited in a hospital corridor. He noticed the wrinkle between her eyebrows the morning the blue heart disappeared and the procurement of anesthesia was confirmed. He noticed she did not ask him. Instead, she acted, as if agency were something to be hoarded. She sold the necklace to a pawnshop a block away. The clerk, a man whose own life seemed stitched together from dangling receipts and nicknames, offered less than she expected. Vivian counted the notes like talismans in the shop's dim light, each bill another beat of her mother's heart. It still wasn't enough. She cash advanced the rest against the contract before signing the paperwork that made the payments official and immediate. The nurse's eyes when she left the hospital that night measured something like pity and something like respect. When you trade a thing that once meant love for a thing that buys survival, you become very good at not sleeping. On the outside, Tyson's world watched and judged. On the inside, his rooms had a different acoustics, silence that rose and frightened him. He read the summaries his assistant Edwin left on the desk and sometimes rewrote compassionate replies that he never sent. He had the instinct for control that made him excellent at business and terrible at letting people simply be. He learned early that power could protect what mattered. He also learned that power could hide what it broke. Vivian's life after selling the blue heart fractured into appointments and indignities. There were good days. Her mother's surgery was a technical success. And there were small triumphs, a nurse's warm smile, a doctor's careful assessment, a slow return of appetite. But the world outside the hospital had a habit of insisting on payment in forms she could not generate. Reputation, whitened teeth, a pedigree of people who knew the right names. One evening, 2 years into the arrangement, a woman in a silk dress leaned across a gleaming marble table in a downtown restaurant and offered Vivian cash to leave. The woman's laugh sparkled like cut crystal, indifference her decoration. "Just disappear," she said, as if Vivian were an ornament she had outgrown. The cashier, the maître d', the couple at the corner booth, everyone watched to see what the city's charity would do. Vivian's answer was measured, a small, raw thing. She declined. The woman thumped her palm against the table. "You don't understand what you are," she started. Tyson, who had been at another end of the room, stood then as if a cord pulled. He walked over with the kind of stillness that made people move aside. His voice, when he spoke, had the bluntness of command and the chill of calculation. "Do not touch her." It was not the first time he had told someone not to touch Vivian. That night the refusal struck for reasons she could not name. It wasn't protection like a shield, it was possession like a map. After the woman left with her entourage and the clink of her heels, Vivian sat in the quiet that followed and felt the bones of herself counted. Protection that tasted like ownership was still protection, she told herself. It was enough for now. If this had been a single scene in a city that holds many, it would have been small. But the arrangement had a way of siphoning dignity into its machinery. She learned to take the compliments that were performances, to accept the rides that were choreographed, to laugh on cue when the cameras, always there like flies, needed something to photograph. She learned to eat gratitude like it was food. She also learned that gratitude could be weaponized. Later, a rival would take her smile and present it as proof that Vivian was a willing participant, not an indebted woman. The humiliation that would be quoted in tabloid columns as "that night at Le Chêne" began as a whisper and ended as a headline. A rival, Annabelle Luo, who had once shared a boyfriend with someone and later learned how thin a civil veneer could be, posted a video of Vivian leaving a party with Tyson. The footage was cut and soundtracked. The city loved a tidy story. The kept woman and the ruthless CEO. Anonymous comments multiplied like fungus. Vivian's mother, when she saw the images in a narcotic haze of painkillers, did not understand the mechanics of public shaming. She only asked, in a voice like a distant radio, if there were enough pills. The contract that had promised to keep them afloat now felt like a leash. And yet the alternative, no care, no surgery, was not a choice. Vivian understood sacrifice in the way only people who must feed someone with a broken spine know. It is both a currency and a prayer. When she started looking for work outside Tyson's orbit, the city offered her dressed as rejection. Interviews turned to pitying smiles. Employers asked why she had a gap or suggested more flexible roles. That meant cleaning bathrooms in a storefront near a junior college. Applications were read as biographies, and biographies were used to write stories about who she must have been to be where she was. She learned to answer a question that was always the same. "What are you looking for?" Truth sounded like a trap. She said, "Stability." On paper she had a respectable resume. Years of hospitality shifted to a pattern of precision, a portfolio that showed design sense gleaned from years of arranging hotel rooms and beds for executives. But resumes do not erase the sudden hunger in someone's eyes when reputation is their first currency. Several offices that interviewed her had friends of Tyson's planted quietly in the back, used as litmus. Rumors circulated that the Fu group liked to maintain a certain narrative. Make no scene and everything will be tidy. For Vivian, every door that closed tightened the knot around the word dignity. Then Colby Wang noticed her. Colby was the sort of man who negotiated the kind of deals that rewrote city skylines. He was loud in uppers and soft in his assessments, and he loved tests the way gamblers loved dice. When he started the landscaping project that became a small war between developers and municipal commissions, he needed someone who could see what others missed, someone who could propose a scheme that would placate both bureaucracy and aesthetics. On a whim, or perhaps on intuition, he called in Vivian, whose brief career in arranging spaces had a sincerity that paper could not measure. Colby's office smelled of citrus and old leather. He sat across from her, watching her with a head tilt that considered whether she would bite. "You think you can design for people who will tear it down if it doesn't look worthy of their Instagram?" he asked. Vivian looked at him as if he had asked whether she could breathe. "I design for people who will live with it," she said, "not for those who will only document it." Thus began the most dangerous offer, an opportunity and a public stage. If she did well, she might reclaim something like a career, something outside of another man's pocket. If she failed, the world would be quick to blame her for overreaching. The project was not glamorous, converting a brown, neglected public courtyard into a green refuge by the river, negotiating with city permits, and angling displays that could soften the Fu Group's newest development. But it carried weight in her hands because it meant building something real. Tyson watched in a way that had become familiar. He observed from a distance the way she moved her shoulder muscles when she measured light, the way she smiled when a vendor believed in her pitch. He also watched as people tired her out, pushed against her, and demanded proofs that she did not have time to fetch. He wanted to interfere. Some nights he sat in the dark of his apartment and wrote stern texts that were never sent, until one morning he did send one. It said, bluntly, "Be careful." The note read like a command. Vivian folded the message and put it in the pocket of her jacket, a small private concession to his concern. Being watched was not the same as being controlled, she reminded herself. She could meet this man in the middle of other people's judgments and still stand straight. Edwin served as an intermediary between these worlds. He had been Tyson's assistant for years before he became something more like a sentinel for the household. He could move through rooms without disturbing the dust, and he had a way of offering small kindnesses that were not invasive. For Vivian, he was practical in the ways that mattered, bringing extra blankets to her mother's ward without fanfare, rerouting a delivery of sterile supplies when the hospital ran low, making sure that Tyson, when he intervened, did so in ways that did not see her feel indebted more than necessary. "Your mother asked if you would eat something today," Edwin said once, handing her a thermos with soup that smelled faintly of ginger. He did not look for thanks. He only opened the conversation where Vivian had left it. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know," he answered. But he wouldn't have known to remember. Edwin's loyalty to Tyson was professional at the axis, personal where it had always counted. He saw Tyson soften sometimes when the man thought no one watched. He also saw signs that every small concession Tyson made was logged and catalogued by his conscience, even if that conscience was practiced in private. On the site, Vivian's hands became the measure of her new world. She argued with contractors who called her Miss, with a sneer that meant girl. She navigated permits, reconciled budgets, and learned to read municipal codes like a new language. The courtyard project became a crucible. Colby liked that about her. He liked the way she could stand and argue for a shade tree in the face of a CFO who wanted another parking slot. He liked the way she refused to water down a plan he judged as honest. Stacy Gu entered the scene like a cameo from the city's glittering circles. A woman with the kind of certainty that suggested family fortune wore her like a second skin. She had been taught to claim what was hers without apology. Where Vivian was careful with words, Stacy was theatrical. She smiled in public and sharpened knives in private. The city's social registry often confused generosity with inheritance, and Stacy used that confusion like currency. Annabelle, meanwhile, watched from the edges. She had the sort of purple smile that did not reach her eyes. She was engaged once to a man who had learned to value influence over affection, and now nursed a splintered pride by destroying the reputations of those who dared to be inconvenient. Spencer, the one who had once promised fidelity to Vivian and then walked away to choose advantage, re-entered like a wrong message that never fully deleted. He had excuses, he had a new ring, and he had the kind of quiet that suggested he still counted debts. Each of them represented a pressure, social climbing, envy, and the awkward geometry of people who misread survival as ambition. They did not care about the calculus that had made Vivian sign a paper. They cared about optics. For them, vulnerability was spectacle. By the time the courtyard was halfway finished, someone had called the press. A gossip column published a piece implying the Fu Group's generosity in hiring Vivian was a PR stunt. Photos of her measuring azaleas were captioned with insinuations. The comment sections filled with jokes that turned into assumptions that turned into attack dogs. She began to understand that the project was not only about plants and permits. It was a test of whether a woman with a contract could survive being expected to be invisible. Colby watched the fallout with a gambler's glee. "Let them talk," he told her one day as rain pelted the newly planted soil. "If your work stands, theirs will rot in the rumor mill. The ground doesn't care what tabloids print." Vivian wanted to believe that. She wanted, more than anything, to let the work be the work. But the city had a way of measuring a woman's worth by how loudly she protested. When Annabelle planted a story about lavish dinners paid for by Tyson's money, the damage spread like an oil slick. Contractors withdrew because their banks feared the scandal. Vendors demanded higher deposits. The project stalled. That night, Vivian sat on the low edge of the courtyard with dirt under her nails and a bag of instant noodles between her palms. The soup tasted like the cost of refusing to disappear. The lights from the nearby condominium threw shadows on the newly planted saplings. She felt the weight of expectations pressing in from every side. Tyson arrived without fanfare, as he sometimes did when he could not bear the distance. He stood where the old tiles met the new soil and watched her, eyes narrowed. For a moment he said nothing, and the silence held the shape of something like apology. "You should have told me sooner," he said finally. She looked up. "Told you what?" "That they would sabotage the suppliers. That they would try to make you fail." Vivian laughed once, a short sound that had no humor. "You know I could have stopped them." He did not need to be told which them. The Fu name was a magnet for both blessing and curse. "I didn't see it," she admitted. They met, briefly and without specifying, in the place between protection and possession. He offered to call his people. She accepted, but with a stipulation: no interference that would make the project seem like another show of power. She wanted the work to stand on its own merits. She wanted the city to accept it as a place that had been saved, not as an exhibit bought by force. He agreed. It was a compromise that pleased neither of them entirely. Yet Tyson's interventions were not always without cost. In one instance, when a contractor attempted to force a change that would have stripped the courtyard of its public seating for an exclusive boardroom entrance, Tyson's security confronted the man. Words escalated. The man lost his temper and shoved one of Tyson's men. Security detained him until the police arrived. The contractor's license was suspended pending investigation. The city praised the swift action, but the contractors whispered that the Fu group had used undue leverage. Vivian watched the ripple of consequences and felt uneasy. She did not want to become an agent of retribution. She wanted a garden. But as the project resumed and benches were installed where elderly neighbors could sit, she felt a small vindication. It was not the massive victory she had imagined that would erase years, but it was a beginning scaffold. And in the background, the machines of gossip persisted. Spencer reappeared on the scene ostensibly as a consultant to a rival developer. Annabelle's posts multiplied. Stacy's smile sharpened in photographs next to Tyson at dinners, where champagne glasses were angled precisely. Each new image became a tally against her. The neighborhood children loved the courtyard. They ran along the new paths, the city's gray concrete softened by beds of lavender and ferns. An elderly woman from a nearby building sat every morning with a thermos and a dog, telling stories to anyone who would listen about a girl who had planted a tree with hands calloused by other people's lives. The small coalition of public affection felt like warm light. But a headline regarding Vivian's past relationship with Spencer caused the bank that had been considering a modest loan to decide otherwise. The loan officer, after a long sigh, leaned across the counter and said something Vivian had heard before, but never stopped being bruised by, "We don't bet on people with headlines." By now, the city had learned to reduce complexity to sound bites. For Vivian, the courtyard was a counter-argument, a place where people could not easily reduce her to a label. She worked like a person building a life one brick at a time, but someone always sought to pull up those bricks and show the engineers mistakes. The pressure mounted toward an event that would test more than a project's viability. A charitable gala was scheduled for the Fu Group, an evening designed to showcase philanthropic contributions while the company negotiated new public contracts. Invitations went to the city's elite, and the courtyard was chosen as the gala's after-party. For the elites, it was an accessory. For Vivian, it was the public unveiling of months of labor. The week before the gala, whispers told of an engagement announcement that would be made during the evening. The city loved symbolism wrapped in silk. There would be speeches, clinking glasses, photographs of Tyson with the woman he would present as an emblem of continuity, stability dressed in silk. Whoever stood by his side would, by inference, stand for more than a single night. Vivian heard arranging hands and measured the shape of the world that would be reinforced by that announcement. In the back rooms of the Fu mansion, Tyson's mother, Madame Fu, polished arguments into polished mandates. She preferred Tyson's decisions to be immovable, a line drawn in the sand that nobody in the family could cross. "His image is essential," she said to him one evening, her fingers steady on a bone china cup. "You cannot be the fault line that invites chaos." Tyson's jaw clenched in a way that suggested he knew how both to obey and to betray. He had spent a lifetime being taught that to compromise was to lose his edge. He also, privately, had catalogued the moments when small acts of kindness had saved him from falling apart. Vivian's refusal to be invisible had been one such. For Vivian, the gala's promise was double-edged. If the mayor and the board praised her work, vendors might return, the bank might reconsider, and the courtyard would be seen as a gift to the city rather than an imported curiosity. If the gala made her into a spectacle, if her role in the courtyard was denounced as purchased, it could be the end of the fragile trust she had built with neighbors and the elderly woman who had taken to calling her the gardener. The night arrived with a sky like wet charcoal. Guests walked beneath lanterns into a space that had once been a forgotten corner of the block. The courtyard smelled like lavender and cut grass, and a city trying to pretend everything was safe. Tables were set with linen that had almost no experience with hard work. Florists arranged extras, and photographers scouted angles that would make the Fu Group look both benevolent and decisive. Vivian stood near the back and watched. She had a dress that did not advertise what she could not afford. Someone, Edwin, had smoothed her hair and given her a small piece of sage to hold for good luck. She felt like a seamstress in the theater of money, a woman whose labor may or may not be acknowledged by the critics. Stacy arrived with a party that threw currency like confetti. Annabelle stayed at the periphery, eyes sharp as an awl. Spencer lingered in territories that let him appear helpful and inadvertently cruel. The air hummed with small currents of old resentments and cautious opportunism. Tyson moved in a self-possessed orbit, offering smiles that did not reach his eyes and gestures that smacked of the choreography of power. Near the center of the gathering, Madame Fu found her audience and planted seeds of expectation about future unions, about alliances that would protect the family. Vivian felt every whisper like a draft. She felt the arrangement in a way she had thought buried, how much of her had become currency, and whether she would ever be permitted to be anything other than payment. When the moment came, Tyson took the podium and delivered a speech about urban renewal, about how the city's forgotten corners could be redeemed with careful stewardship. He praised volunteers, he praised donors, he praised the community, and, with the practiced skill of a man who wrote 1,000 apologies into a single paragraph, he toasted to those who suffered and fought so the city could breathe again. He did not name her. He did not have to. Cameras swept the crowd, and at the far edge, a woman with a sapphire-less throat dug her nails into a napkin until the skin beneath it whispered for relief. After the speech, when the crowd drifted toward champagne and pastries, a small group of guests began to murmur. Someone leaked a photograph on a social feed. Vivian speaking with a contractor whose opinion mattered, captured in the rawness of being engaged. Someone else took it and captioned it with a thin joke that implied she was only present because of Tyson. Annabelle's phone buzzed in her purse, and she smiled like an assassin who prefers a dagger to a shout. Vivian felt all of it, every lump and jibe folding into itself. She walked toward the service exit, toward the area where volunteers emptied trash, where workers leaned and smoked in quiet. She did not want to be a spectacle. She wanted to be where the people who had helped her build something lived their small victories. A voice called her name, a man's voice that once might have belonged to someone she loved and had been left by. Spencer stepped forward, a bottle of remorse stable in his hands. "Vivian," he said, "I didn't know this would be—" "You did," she said, and the word was cold enough to cut the air between them. "You made choices." The moment did not explode. It was precise, as if two knives had silently found edges. Spencer's jaw tightened. Annabelle watched, pleased by the minor carnage her hint had produced. The social feed hummed like a hive. People edged closer for spectacle. Tyson, always a man who kept his distance in public, crossed the courtyard with a path that cleared itself before him. He was not theatrical in the way others were. He was unavoidably decisive. He stopped beside Vivian and looked at Spencer with a scrutiny that seemed to measure whether the man would maintain composure. "You will leave my event," Tyson said. Spencer smiled a smile that meant he wanted to be forgiven by everyone. "I am not causing a scene." "You are causing a scene," Tyson replied. "Outside of it." He turned back to Vivian. "Are you all right?" She met his gaze, and in that exchange there were years of contained statements. "I'm fine," she said. The words were a shield, but they felt thin. Edwin, sensing the risk of escalation, moved like a shadow beside Tyson. He directed security with small gestures, careful not to make the evening's charity into an incident. Yet within minutes, rumor had found the shape of an accusation that would grow. A video of the exchange had been uploaded, edited for venom. The city's appetite for stories that simplified suffering into villain and heroine needed no invitation. After the party, as cars hummed away and the lanterns cooled, Vivian walked home through rain-slick streets, her shoes leaving small dark trails. She thought of the Blue Heart and of what she had traded for stitches of survival. She thought of the courtyard saplings and of how they would need time to root. She thought of the people who had built benches and the elderly woman who would sit in the morning with her dog. She thought of what it meant to be visible and to still carry the weight of judgment. At the edge of sleep, where exhaustion and worry braided into uneasy dreams, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel for years. A small, stubborn hope that perhaps a life could be built without selling pieces of the soul. That this garden might be the first of many things that would allow her to move through the city as a woman with a profession, not an adjunct to someone else's power. But the city does not grant clean new beginnings without charging interest. News outlets would keep feeding the rumor mill, rivals would sharpen their smiles. And somewhere in the wings, plans were being set in motion that would bring the private life of the Fu family to a public crucible. If she had known the price for the next act, she might have hesitated. Instead, she kept walking, and the rain washed the dust from the sapling's leaves as if the city itself were attempting forgiveness. If you love sweeping high-stakes romance with complicated heroes and women who refuse to be erased, subscribe for more stories like this. The next week moved like a coiled spring. Vivian's courtyard work continued amid subtle attacks and quiet supports. Colby negotiated with the board, using every political acumen he had to keep the project's funding intact. Vendors returned after anonymous donors, spurred likely by Tyson's discreet calls, covered past debts. The small victories stacked like stones. Then, a letter arrived at the Fu Manor that threaded its way through reception and into an oak-paneled room where family portraits watched with lens-like eyes. The letter, stamped with a neutral legal insignia, contained information that could change a family's future. A private archive, evidence of lineage and transaction, whispered details about birth certificates and hand-signed affidavits that the Gu family judge had misplaced. For Tyson, reading that letter was like taking a cold bath. For Madame Fu, it was dynamite smeared in honey. The document suggested discrepancies in the Gu family's narrative, an implication that the woman introduced as the Gu heiress had a background not quite in line with the public record. If true, the consequences would ripple into boardrooms, into shareholder votes, into the carefully choreographed plays of power. Vivian at the courtyard site did not yet know about the letter. She had a delivery to oversee and an elderly neighbor to help home with a spade full of soil. She wandered through obligations and small kindnesses, unaware that a private salvo had been fired in the corridors of wealth. Tyson drove home that night with the letter folded in the glove compartment like a live thing. He thought of the decisions that could follow, leverage used to control, courts used to cower, alliances made out of fear. He thought of Vivian, of her stubborn hands, of the way she had refused to accept a gaslight smile. He imagined challenges mounted against her work that would not be answered by his money alone. He felt, with a clarity that startled him, an urge to step in that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with protecting something that had become unexpectedly precious. He had not been ready for the way his protection softened into concern, and concern bled into an awareness that frightened him. Love, when it arrived, would not be tender as a flower. It would be complicated and earned, if it came at all. He sat at a stoplight and thought of the risks: family wrath, shareholder backlash, public spectacle. In the soft place between the ticking of his mind and his pulse, he made a choice he would later examine and interrogate. He would not let the machinery of his world crush what Vivian had built, not because he owned her, but because he had come, unnoticed, to care. It was a thought that unsettled him more than any hostile bidder ever had. Back at the courtyard, a city reporter's phone buzzed with a tip. Something about the Gu heiress might be big. That kind of whisper in the right ear could ignite the sort of public storm that peeled reputations like orange skin. Vivian, who had already learned to brace for blasts, felt the ground tilt. News, in the city, travels fast. So do consequences. The next day, someone began to arrange seats for a ceremony the city would call a future-proofing, an event promising clarity and order. It would be attended by families who had a lot to lose. Vivian tightened her coat against the wind and planted another shrub, fingers numb but steady. She did not reckon with the fact that the next collision would not only put her project in the crosshairs, but would make the bargain she had made, the contract she had signed to keep her mother alive, into a lever that could either crush or rescue them both. The letter in Tyson's glove compartment did not sit like paper, it sat like a summons. For days afterward the Fu house smelled of meetings, low-voiced strategists, polished lawyers, and damnations wrapped as counsel. Madame Fu moved through the rooms like a conductor, her hands never still, making calculations with a mouth that taught everyone else how to make theirs. "We cannot let rumors become precedent," she told Tyson over coffee that tasted of warning. "Control the narrative, secure the shares, present the face they expect." Tyson listened, as he always did, cataloging each phrase for leverage. He had learned the instrument of power so thoroughly that it felt like muscle memory. Yet the letter had shifted something in him beyond balance sheets. It had opened a door he had long avoided, the one that let him look at consequences instead of strategy. When he closed the folder, his mind kept returning to a woman who planted things in a forgotten space, and to a prize of his childhood, the blue heart, that he now realized had anchored more than a bank account. He called Colby. He asked questions that were not only about feasibility, but about decency. Colby, who loved spectacle and had measured his life in bold transactions, surprised him by answering simply, "Let the truth play out. Make sure evidence is airtight. People will follow facts if they are given them clean." Evidence had to be cleaned. So the Fu legal team reached out to an archivist who dealt in brittle documents and old signatures. They found a midwife's report misfiled during a decade of renovations at the Gu family estate. A nurse who had retired to a seaside town remembered a face and a name in a way memory sometimes does. Selectively, but honestly. An affidavit arrived, messy with age and careful with its error, naming a woman who had held a newborn in her arms and signed years later under a signature she had not expected would be summoned. Madame Fu saw opportunity. She also saw risk. If any hint of instability touched Tyson's hand, shareholders would circle like vultures. She arranged private dinners designed to reinforce alliances, promises, investments, quiet transfers that would lock in loyalty. She wanted Stacy, polished, smiling, a mirror of her family, to be the public bride and the family's safe harbor. To Madame Fu, that union was not about two people's tenderness. It was a contract that kept storms at bay. Back at the courtyard, Vivian continued to work in the daylit economy of soil and plans. The city's gossip made small wars around her, but the plants did not argue. The lavender still bent toward summer. Children still took turns on a bench that, 3 months before, had been impossible to imagine. For Vivian, these were small, solid proofs that not everything could be reduced to headlines. And yet the city's appetite for drama spurred dangerous imaginations. Annabelle, who craved the thrill of ruin like a secret her marrow enjoyed, began to move with more malicious intent. She could not unsee Vivian's refusal to be erased. Pride was a currency she hoarded after a failed engagement. Revenge became an investment. She started small, leaks that suggested Vivian had charged extravagant expenses to the Fu Group, doctored emails implying she had received preferential treatment. When those rumors petered under scrutiny, Annabelle escalated. She used a contact from a past life, the kind who owed her favors and preferred quick, brutal solutions, to hatch an idea that would ensure spectacle, the kidnapping of someone close to Vivian, a threat that would both punish and force Vivian publicly to beg for mercy. It was calculated cruelty. Vivian's mother had recovered enough to be transferred from intensive care to a private convalescence ward. A quieter room, a cleaner staff, a promise whispered by a doctor that more therapy lay ahead. In the small window of that recovery, when guardians were distracted with navigating caretakers and paperwork, an outside player attempted to exploit vulnerability. They watched shifts, researched routes, and planned a moment when the ward would be thin with eyes. Tyson learned of the plot before it happened, because somebody close to him had watched the pattern of Annabelle's madness and chose to go to someone who would act. Edwin, who had a way of moving through both households like a necessary presence, got the tip and did not hesitate. The call to Tyson came at 2 in the morning. He was awake because his mind had kept the paper in his hands for days like a burning ember. He did not make a show of it. He moved with violent quiet. He put people on notice, called for surveillance in and around the hospital, and arranged a presence that would not read as intimidation, but as safety. When the men sent by Annabelle tried to take advantage of a late-night transfer, they were met by security and local police, who had been alerted in a way that respected procedure. The operation collapsed without spectacle, because Tyson had insisted that it be handled with legal rigor. Annabelle's hirelings were arrested. They offered what desperate people offer, names that sounded like bargaining chips. When charges were filed, part of the evidence came from a witness who had been paid to keep silence until shaken loose by conscience. The court moved with the kind of deliberate speed that occasionally honors justice. The news of the attempted abduction ran alongside the rumor sheets, but the tone was different. Criminal, not scandalous. Vivian sat on a bench she had planted and watched the headline read, "Attempted kidnapping foiled, 9 arrests." The relief that came after such a night was complicated. Vivian was angry first, angry at being targeted, at people who used cruelty for sport, but she was also shaken in a way that reverberated through her decisions. She understood better than before the length some would go to for power. She understood, in a new and raw way, the danger of being tied to someone whose enemies could find you by association. Annabelle did not escape unscathed. The court process showed the kind of public unmasking that fit a melodrama. Testimonies, recorded messages, bank transfers. the slow unspooling of a woman who had built a life on small malignities. In the courtroom, she pretended indignation, then anger, then defeat. She would not be spared the legal consequences. Her social life withered. Friends washed their hands of her. For Vivian, the sensation was not triumph so much as a clearing, an acknowledgement that no one should be allowed to weaponize another's suffering. But courts move at their own pace, and consequences do not erase past harms. The noise of the Gu family letter did not fade. It simply rearranged itself around legal testimonies and shareholder calls. The Gu family, seething with private fears, prepared their own counters. Stacy, who had been raised to be a public emblem, felt the ground under her feet shift. It was at a pre-wedding banquet, an event arranged to make the impending union feel inevitable, that the archive's contents found a public home. The banquet hall glittered under lights that seemed to multiply every whisper. Guests arrived in predictable patterns, alliances, flattery, smiles practiced to disarm. Madame Fu had arranged the seating as if setting pieces on a board. Tyson had decided he would not let the moment pass into an easy performance. He had convened a meeting with a regulatory official, a retired judge who had become a consultant, and the archivist who had found the midwife's report. He wanted evidence presented in a way that could not be twisted into gossip. He wanted the truth to be anchored in documents and testimony. He stayed away from theatrics. He wanted facts to speak in steadier voices. At the banquet, speeches rolled like pre-ordered thunder. Stacy smiled and moved with an ease taught by tutors. Madame Fu made a speech about continuity and the responsibility of families who bore the city on their shoulders. Cameras circled, and somewhere a reporter composed a headline designed to feed a morning's worth of copy. Then Tyson stood, quietly, and asked for the room's attention. He had a folder, and his voice, when he spoke, was not the clipped baritone of a man giving orders. It was quieter, and that quiet carried a gravity that made people listen. "There are things kept from us not to protect but to control," he said. "We found a record. It changes what we have been told." He laid out the documents, a midwife's affidavit, a hospital ledger, a series of signatures that did not match the Gu family's current narrative. The retired judge explained, with deliberate calm, that while legal processes would need to sort inheritance and identity formally, the evidence demanded public acknowledgement. The room did not know how to breathe. Stacy went pale. Madame Fu's jaw tightened. Whispers multiplied like spring water from a hidden tap. For Stacy, the revelation was not only identity theft in the abstract, it was an unraveling of the narrative that had given her place. For Madame Fu, it threatened everything she had spent her life preserving. The Gu parents, present and visibly shaken, made statements that read like the first honest lines of a longer confession. They were surprised, hurt, and embarrassed. Three things a family who hoarded image seldom wants to be. Questions about who had orchestrated a switch arose like weeds. Malpractice, deceit, a botch of record-keeping, a decision made in a moment of need decades prior. The answers would be messy. The consequences would be legal, social, and financial. Tyson did not use the revelation as a cudgel against Stacy. He used it, bluntly and carefully, to expose a lie that had been layered over the truth, and to demand that the Gu family submit to an independent review. He insisted that neither he nor his family would weaponize the matter for gain. That stance shocked everyone who had expected the Fu group to pounce for advantage. Tyson had become, in a way that surprised even him, guardian rather than predator. The banquet dissolved into chaos. Reporters circled, cameras flashed, and people scrambled to shape their versions of events. Annabelle watched from a distance with a look that no photograph could soften. Some guests, who had been confident they knew the story's ending, left in an awkward shuffle. Shareholders who had counted on predictability recoiled. The industry press speculated about resignations and trust funds. But the night was not simply about scandal. In the center of it, like a slow-turning gear, was Vivian. She had come on invitation as the courtyard steward, and she had not expected to be dragged into a family storm. When the revelation broke, she felt small and exposed, a person who had been taught how to survive spotlight and rumor. She also felt oddly relieved. The truth, once it unspooled into public daylight, had a way of clearing false charges. Tyson's next step astonished those who had known him only as a man who calculated risks with the coldness of a surgeon. He did not follow the direction Madame Fu had prepared. He walked to where Vivian stood near the doorway, muddy from the day's work and strangely luminous in the banquet lighting. He did not make a statement of ownership. Instead, he spoke with a sincerity that he had rarely allowed in public. "Vivian," he said, and the room tightened as if holding a breath. I need to tell everyone something. I have intervened in ways I should have, ways that sometimes felt like they saved you, and other times felt like they took from you. I want to be clear. I have made mistakes." It was the language of someone admitting imperfection. It was different from his usual absolutes. The admission landed with a sound like distant rain. Vivian looked at him, measuring whether this would be another line of command or a real reaching. She could see in his face the worn edges of someone who had been constructing a new way to move. "You always make it sound like the mistakes were meant for me to fix," she said, voice steady. "I've been fixing them because I had to." His answer was not an excuse, it was a telling. "I didn't know how to be anything but in control," he said. "I thought that was love, safeguard, fortress. But I have watched what happens when control is used instead of care. That is on me to change." The room murmured. Photographers leaned in. Tyson took one step further, not to claim but to offer. "I cannot erase what happened," he said, "but I can stand here and make a choice. I will not let this family make you a public emblem or a secret. I will not let them use this revelation to buy what they should owe in accountability. Vivian, if you will allow me, I want to be someone you can trust without fear of ownership." It was a confession without grand gestures. It was also, unexpectedly, an emotional pivot he had earned through watching her fight, through seeing the way she refused to be eradicated. He did not kneel. He did not produce a ring. He offered his voice and the power his name carried. That was the beginning of a different kind of surrender. The surrender of a man who had realized power, unchecked, hurt those it claimed to protect. Vivian listened. She had learned over years to keep her choices deliberate. The arrangement that had saved her mother's life had been a contract of survival. It had never been a love story. She had accepted the ways it kept them afloat because she needed to. Now, in a hall packed with people who watched for sensation, she decided to make a demand that would not be moved by spectacle. "If you mean that," she said quietly, "then prove it in ways that don't cost me my life. I will not be saved by secrecy or by a headline. If you want to be with me, it will be with respect for my autonomy and with public steps that show equality." The room heard the words as if they were edged with steel. Tyson met her gaze and nodded. He had no right to ask more than she could freely give. The moment that followed was not a theatrical choosing, but the beginning of negotiations, of terms that honored both the personal and the public. He made a promise, and he meant it. He would step back from decisions that directly affected Vivian's work and her mother's care. He would ensure that any help he offered would not be given in ways that exposed her to ownership, and he would open channels that would allow her to operate with professional independence. Those were not small concessions in a world that traded control for compliance. Madame Fu scowled, but even she could not erase a public moment when the heir of a conglomerate announced he would alter the script. The Gu family's identity crisis required more than rhetoric. The independent review Tyson had insisted on began to pull threads that had been sewn tightly for decades. Public statements were carefully constructed. The court of public opinion raged in commentary sections, but legal actions began to follow a more precise path. Formal petitions for record correction, interviews for those who had been present at births, and an investigation into whether official malfeasance had occurred. Attorneys drew lines across ledgers and questioned custodians of archives. Stacy's life unraveled in a different register. She wept in private rooms and took to the terraces of social calendars that became deserts. When it became clear that the evidence could not be easily erased, Madame Fu shifted strategy. Damage control, followed by an offer to keep Stacy financially protected. Yet for Stacy, the issue was not money alone. It was identity, and identity does not mend easily when it is public property. The Fu Group, meanwhile, had to weather shareholder meetings where furious voices demanded clarity and morality. Tyson made deliberate choices. He initiated transparency protocols that surprised the board and made his mother more cautious in her maneuvers. He offered to subject certain family matters to independent oversight, a suggestion that made some elders in the room feel betrayed and others consider whether their own position had become untenable. Annabelle's trial proceeded. Under questioning, she cracked. Under evidence, she unraveled. Her role in the kidnapping plot came to light through bank records and testimony. When the judge read the sentence, it felt to some like a seal closing on a storm. But sentences cannot change the way someone has been treated. They can only say, publicly, that such acts are unacceptable and will be answered. Spencer, who had tried to recapture what he had lost by trying to align himself with advantage, found doors closing. Sponsors who had seen him as a convenient social partner receded. In the quiet spaces of his apartment, he had to look at choices he had made on the altar of status. Those choices offered no easy forgiveness. He faded from the scene, not into anonymity, but into the kind of second-tier regret that will not get you welcomed back. Through the chaos, the courtyard became a refuge that everyone came to touch. For the neighborhood, it was a proof that persistent labor can change small landscapes. For Vivian, it was a living ledger of work that had not been performed for spectacle, but for life. She began to be invited to speak at community planning sessions, to advise on small urban projects, and to consult on a municipal initiative that wanted gardens where heat islands had been. The shift was incremental. One commission, then another, each a small declaration that her skills could exist outside the room where money had once defined her. Colby, true to his nature, celebrated in his way. He used his influence to get Vivian space to run a pilot project across town. "You needed proof, not pity," he said, and offered to underwrite part of the initiative anonymously until the city agreed to match funds. Tyson insisted the fund be public, not anonymous. Vivian accepted neither gift as charity. She negotiated for a contract that named her as lead designer and gave her clear oversight. That contract read like respect. Tyson, true to his promise, began to dismantle patterns he had not recognized were harmful. He still protected, but he learned to do so with counsel and consent. He took professional advice on what it meant to use resources to protect versus to possess. He authorized a foundation that would support urban renewal projects, with Vivian as a public partner rather than a beneficiary, signing documents that carried her name and voice. He did this without fanfare, but not secretly. The gesture meant more because it was named and not hidden. There were still nights when the old armor clicked into place. He had been taught to control, and old habits die slowly. But he also had small acts that marked change, calls to check on a vendor, texts that asked how many hours she had been awake, and, once, a bouquet of daisies left at the courtyard's entrance with a note. "For the woman who makes the city unreadable to cynics." Vivian kept the note in a drawer rather than on a pedestal. She did not need proof of affection the way one needs oxygen. She needed proof of a changed pattern. The Blue Heart re-entered the story in a way that neither of them quite anticipated. One afternoon, months after the attempted abduction, while Vivian supervised the planting of a new row of native grasses, a courier arrived with a small, unassuming box. Inside was the chipped sapphire pendant, wrapped in tissue that smelled faintly of old cedar. Attached was a note in tidy handwriting. "Thought you should have this back." Vivian did not cry. She held the necklace, and the skin of her fingers recognized the curve. The pendant had been more than a piece of metal and stone. It had been a tether to a woman she loved and a life she had promised to protect. She understood that its return was symbolic, and she also knew that symbols are only useful when the people who give them know how to respect what they symbolize. She asked Edwin about the delivery. He gave her a look that held 1,000 small truths and then nodded. "He bought it back," Edwin said. "Then he asked me to make sure it found you. He said it was the right time." There was, in that delivery, a humility. If Tyson had bought the Blue Heart earlier to hide it in his safe, then returned it now, it read differently. A reclaiming rather than a purchase, a gesture that did not try to repurchase a past for power, but to acknowledge it had belonged to someone else all along. She kept the pendant in her pocket for a long time. That night she sat by her mother's bed and let the metal touch the skin of her palm. She told her mother about the courtyard's new path, and about a child who had learned to tie her shoelace there. Her mother smiled in a way that suggested memory and appetite reassembling themselves. Recovery, the doctors had said, would be uneven, but each day there was an inch of progress, and those inches were many. It was not smooth. Tyson still faltered. He still sent notes about schedules, and sometimes old possessiveness flashed in ways he had to apologize for. But apologies came more frequently and more honestly. They were often followed by concrete acts, a public endorsement of her work, a withdrawal of interference, or a phone call asking permission rather than issuing instruction. Vivian negotiated, as she had from the beginning, with a keen eye. She insisted on contracts for each project, transparent, named, and binding. She asked for a seat on the advisory board of the Urban Renewal Foundation, not as a figurehead, but as a professional voice. Tyson, who could have tried to appoint people to make the foundation look independent, accepted her demand. The foundation granted her authority and budget oversight. That change mattered more than any jewelry. It meant she could shape work and hire teams without being undermined by a whisper. The weeks unfolded into months, and with them came a new kind of stability. The Fu family could no longer assume they could choreograph every public moment as they wished. The Gu family faced a reckoning that would take years to sort, but which began with honesty. Annabelle's legal reckoning had been public. Spencer's consequences were social and quiet. Madame Fu found herself constrained by board votes and public pressure. For Tyson, the greatest consequence had been internal, learning to look at power and see where it had been cruel. When he finally spoke fully, and not because a crowd demanded it, but because he had to, his confession was not a theatrical flourish. On the terrace of a private club, under a winter sky that made lights look like promises, he let his walls down in a way that had nothing to do with posturing. He told Vivian about a childhood where approval was rationed, and where the sense of never being enough led him to measure worth by wins. He told her about a father who had taught him to hide tenderness, and a mother who had taught him to bury doubts. He told her, in fitful sentences that sometimes broke, that the fear of losing control had once been a survival tactic. "You deserve someone who can love you without annexing you," he said finally. "I've been trying to learn what that looks like." She listened and did not soften automatically. Love demanded more than confession. It demanded sustained practice. She asked, plainly, what he would do when an old instinct kicked in, the impulse to fix, to shield, to decide for her. He told her he would seek counsel. He told her he would be accountable to the Foundation's board and to independent advisors. He told her he would not interfere with her contracts and that he would sign documents acknowledging her professional autonomy. It was unromantic in the best way, practical terms for human behavior. That discussion became, for them, the blueprint of what partnership could be when it was negotiated rather than assumed. When the city later hosted an awards ceremony for community projects, Vivian was there as lead, and Tyson the first to clap. Cameras focused on the presentation of a plaque with her name as the primary credit. He stayed in the audience and let her stand in front of the crowd, not as a shadow to his light, but as someone whose work could be judged on its own merits. For Vivian, the moment tasted like a currency she had earned, rather than been given. And yet love is not a tidy ledger. It arrives in small private ways as well as public proofs. On a rainy afternoon, when they were both exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with their public myths, Tyson sat at the courtyard's edge and watched Vivian teach a group of teenagers how to prune. One of the teens looked at her with a kind of reverence that made Vivian laugh. Tyson's chest felt oddly full, a softness he did not use to labeling. He reached out in a motion that could have been imperial, and instead wrapped a shawl around her shoulders without asking, a small kindness offered as partnership rather than possession. She stayed. She stayed because she had chosen to after weighing all options. She stayed because the man who had once been her employer had, over months and through concrete steps, learned to be accountable. She stayed because she began to trust him in ways that had nothing to do with contracts and everything to do with chosen restraint. There was no dramatic finale with a cathedral packed full of cameras. There was, instead, a small evening in the courtyard. The lavender swayed under a soft lamp. Tyson had arranged for a modest dinner. No press, no spectacle. He passed Vivian a plate with food he had learned she liked, and she watched him with the patient doubt of someone who had been burned by promises before. "I will not ask you to erase what you had to do," Tyson said quietly. "I only ask you to choose what we build next with me." Vivian put the blue heart in her palm. The pendant sat warm where metal met skin. She thought of a woman who had taught her to be brave, of nights in hospital rooms smelling of disinfectant and hope, of the years she had spent negotiating dignity. She thought of the men and women who had come to the courtyard and said thank you without knowing what kind of currency those words were. "I choose," she said, and her voice was precise. "But not because I'm saved by the name you hold. I choose because I believe this can be a partnership that lets me work, to grow, to be accused and defended on my terms, not because someone signs my fate for me." He nodded. He understood the sentence's weight in a way only someone who had been given power would. They spoke then, not in declarations but in logistics, territory, boundaries, work schedules, transparency. They drafted nothing with champagne. They signed a document, weeks later, that spelled out the agreements they had made, public, legal, and careful. It read less like a pronouncement of eternal bliss and more like infrastructure, how to disagree, how to resolve conflict, how to ensure neither could unilaterally make decisions that would put the other in danger. That contract was small and practical, a map of a relationship built with conscious consent. Months after, Vivian's mother walked again with a walker and a laugh that could sometimes be mistaken for defeat only by people who didn't know how long recovery takes. She came to the courtyard often, bringing muffins to children and stories to neighbors. She called Vivian one evening and, in soft clarity, asked if the pendant she had once given still meant as much to her daughter. Vivian placed the blue heart on her mother's palm and said, "It always meant that we would survive." The end of the long arc was not a single crowning triumph. It was a series of small reckonings, an apology written and kept, a legal case that punished malice, board meetings where honesty began to matter, and the slow reclamation of a woman's professional life. The Fu group changed at the margins. The Gu family would heal in time if they chose to. Annabelle faced consequences that would make it hard to return to the same life. Spencer learned that reputation had a cost. As for Tyson, he kept learning. He learned that love could be patient because it had nothing to seize. He kept making errors and kept correcting them, and that stubbornness to change mattered more than a single confession. And Vivian, who had sold a necklace to save a life, ended up with more agency than she had ever been promised. She did not become a paragon because of love. She became a partner because she insisted on terms that honored her. On a late spring evening, the courtyard hummed with the soft noise of a neighborhood that had once been tired. Children chased fireflies. An elderly man nursed a cup of tea. Vivian and Tyson sat on a bench he had refused to let be privatized months before, and they watched a tree they'd planted together catch the light. He did not touch her, not in the way ownership demands. He simply offered his hand, and she placed hers in it by choice. The blue heart lay against her collarbone like a small compass. They had made deals with the world, with lawyers, and with themselves. Some deals had been forced, some had been negotiated, some had been redrafted over late-night conversations. The first bargain, the contract signed to save a mother, had been the catalyst, ugly and necessary. But out of that painful commerce, something unexpected had grown. Two people learning to love without consuming, to protect without possessing, and to build a life where both had room to be whole. If you love this kind of slow, dramatic romance and want more stories of messy bargains that turn into something honest, like and subscribe, and check out the playlist for more.